All right, this is Mr. Gillum, and today we're going to be converting between decimals and percentages, and from percentages to decimals. So the first thing I want to talk about is what percent means, because I think that there's a little bit of confusion when I talk about percent and decimals. And when I say percent, that really means per 100. If you think about the word cent, and I do want you to write this down, or the prefix cent, that means 100. Okay, there's 100 pennies in a dollar, so we call each penny a cent. There's 100 in a dollar. And so when I say percent, I'm talking about per 100. Okay, and then 100% is a whole. 100% is a whole, and less than that represents the amount of part of a whole. Okay, so 100% would be the entire whole. That would be 100% modeled right there, all of it, the whole thing. Now, if I took half of that away, I'd have half as much percent. So if I only had half, that would represent 50%. Okay, if I took another half away from that, I would have 25%. Okay, now we can think of those things as percents, and I'm sure you're a little bit familiar with how those things work. However, we also can think of them as decimals. Okay, so I can think of as a whole as 100%, or I can think of it as one whole. And that's what we've been using in fractions when we were doing fractions. When we modeled our fractions, we considered one unit to be one whole, not 100%. And so this wouldn't be 50%, it would be 0.5 of a whole. And you probably are familiar with a half and 0.5 being related to one another. And I wouldn't call this 25%, I would say that this is 0.25 of 1. Okay, 25 of the 100 pieces. And in fact, that tells me also that when I have decimals, this is the hundredth spot, because it takes 100 0.01s to make one whole. Maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't. And we call this the tens spot here. That guy right there is the 10 spot, because it takes 10 of those to make one whole. And then back here, that's the thousandth spot, because it takes 1,000 0.001s to make one whole. We call it 1,000th. Okay, and so percents and decimals are very closely related in that if I added a 0 there and I added a decimal here, you can see that there's a relationship between the decimal representation and the percent representation, and the fact that they both share the same numbers. And in fact, if I look a little closer, if I multiplied the decimal 25 hundredths by 100, that would actually equal 25%, and that is actually the pattern that we're going to be observing today. If I multiplied 0.50 by 100, that would get me to 50%. If I multiplied 1 times 100, that would get me to 100%. Okay, and so there's a very distinct relationship there between decimals and percents. If I'm moving from a decimal to a percent, I'm multiplying by 100. The same goes for moving a percent to a decimal. Instead of multiplying, I would be dividing. And so that's going to bring me to my next point here, moving these decimals into percents. Okay, so we're going to do a few practice problems, and I think that once you get the hang of it, it's going to be pretty easy for you to do them pretty fast, pretty efficiently. The trick is going to be remembering that, because it might not stick with you because you can do them so fast. So how you change a decimal into percentages like this. You multiply the decimal by 100 and you include the percentage sign. Okay. If I had a whole up here and I had it cut into 100 different pieces and I had that much of it, 20% of it. Okay, that's 20% of 100%, or it's 0.2 of 1. Either way you want to think about it. Now, that's not necessary to write down, but this is necessary to write down. If I had 0.34 of a whole, I could visualize it as about being, I don't know, that much. That's about 0.34 of one whole. It's also 30%, 34% of a whole. If I'm changing this decimal to a percent, I can multiply it by 100, and that gives me 34%. And it's just that simple. Okay, it's just another way to think about a decimal. Instead of a decimal part of a whole, we think about a percentage part of 100%. 0.85 times 100. Again, if I'm multiplying by 100 for every zero, I move it one decimal place, that's 85%. Okay, notice how my decimals do not have percent signs behind them, and my percentages do. That's not optional. If you're talking in terms of percents, you need to write the percent sign down. 0.93, same thing. If I multiply it by 100, that's 93%. But then we got into a little hiccup in the road here, okay? And sometimes we don't have two numbers, or sometimes we have a lot of numbers. But the process never changes, okay? This represents 8/10. So if I think about a whole into 10 parts, like that, that's 8 of those parts, okay? 8/10. It's a lot of parts. It's a lot of the whole. So instead of just writing 8%, which a lot of students do, they get confused about it. 0.8 times 100 is not 8%. It's actually 80%. And so you need to be very careful, because sometimes the decimals, we don't put those last digits. In fact, they're just placeholders of 0. So when we multiply by 100, we're moving that decimal twice. And so we got to have that 0 in there. 80, not 8%. It's a common mistake I see a lot of students making. They forget that they got to move it twice every time. Always by 100, not by 10. So again, I'm going to multiply 0.2 by 100, and I have, okay, 20%. 2/10 or 20% are the same representation of a whole. And again, that can be confusing because the first 3 that we did had 2 numbers, and the next 2 that we did only had 1 number, but the percents have to do with the amount of a whole. 1.3, even on whole numbers and parts, we have 2 decimal places. We're just multiplying by 100. It looks like 130%. That's going to happen sometimes. You might have more than 100%. That just represents more than one whole. Represents a whole and then another 30% on top. Or 2.7 times 100. Again, we're just moving it 2 spots, 270%. That's just saying that we have 2 wholes, 100%, 100%. That makes 200%, and then 70% of the next whole. Okay, that's how that works. Now, I failed to add another example on there with more than 1 decimal. So let's do another example. Find some space on your paper somewhere to write this example down. If I would like to write that decimal 0.2354 in a percent, again, I'm going to multiply it by 100 because there is 100 parts of a whole. Each percent represents 1/100th. 23.54. I'm just going to move it 2 spots. Okay, so 23.54%. And it's important to include that percent sign on there so we know what we're referring to. So pretty straightforward with changing decimals to percents. Same thing though happens inversely from percents to decimals. Okay, changing the percent to decimal, instead of multiplying by 100, we're going to divide by 100. It's actually the inverse operation. And so when I divide by 100, I can think of it several ways. I can think of it as a fraction, 13/100ths. Well, that doesn't make a very good decimal. It's better of a fraction. Or when I divide by 100, I can think of moving the decimal place 2 spots the other direction. So when I divide by 100, I know that 13 has a decimal here. 2 decimals backwards. My decimal now is 0.13. That is the decimal that represents 13%, 0.13. 25%, very similarly. I'm dividing it by 100 now. I'm going back into decimal form. So I'm going to move the 25. I know has a decimal behind it there. Little sound effect for you all. 0.25. Okay. 78% divided by 100. That'll give me my decimal form. 0.78. All right, it's pretty straightforward once you're getting the hang of it. It's just really modifying where the decimal is. But it is important to remember that this is per 100. Okay, that's going to be very important. Per 100%. 123%. Now this one is bigger than a whole. More than 100% means more than one whole. So when I'm dividing by 100, I might have a decimal that has a whole number part as well, which is okay. The number 123 has a decimal at the end, like all numbers do. I'm going to move it 2 spots to the left, 1.23. Okay, that is going to be my decimal representation of 123%. And then finally, 250% divided by 100 is going to be 2.5. I could write 2.50, but that would be unnecessary. It is the same kind of rule that we followed with 0.8 and 0.2. There's no zero back there. It's not holding a place for another number behind it. It's not necessary to write it down. If it was an estimation, it may be necessary. There's one more that I want to do with you because I didn't put any of these complicated ones on here. Let's do 12.99% as a decimal. Okay, 12.99%. Again, it can be confusing which way to move the decimal. When we're dividing, we're making the number smaller. We'll move it 2 spots. In that case, it's not moving from the end. It's moving from where the decimal lies. So 0.1299 will be the decimal representation of 12.99%. I think that's all I have for you today. I hope that you can convert percentages to decimals and decimals to percents.